For as long as she could remember, Margaret's days had followed the same quiet rhythm. Mornings began with the sound of the kettle boiling, a soft hiss that echoed in her empty kitchen. The hours stretched predictably, tidying her small home, tending to her garden, flipping through novels that no longer held her attention. By the evening, the same armchair waited by the window, her only companion the distant hum of passing cars. Widowed in her early 40s, she had grown accustomed to solitude. Friends encouraged her to get out there, to join clubs or take up hobbies, but Margaret always declined. She wasn't lonely, she told herself, just settled. Life, at her age, wasn't about surprises. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the spark of light entered her otherwise predictable world. She was in the grocery store, moving through the aisles with the same efficiency she applied to all things. Bread, milk, vegetables. Nothing unnecessary, nothing indulgent. In the cereal aisle, she spotted him. He was bent slightly, studying a box of granola with an intensity that struck her as endearing. His tousled dark hair caught the fluorescent light, and he wore a casual jacket that seemed too big for his lean frame. Margaret didn't mean to stare, but there was something about him that held her attention, something youthful and vibrant. She felt a flicker of curiosity, one she couldn't quite place. Their eyes met when he straightened, and to her surprise he smiled. "Excuse me," he said, holding up the box. "Do you think this is actually healthy, or just pretending to be?" Margaret blinked, startled by the question. Well, they're usually more sugar than oats," she replied, her voice unsteady. He laughed, a warm, rich sound that made her chest tighten. "That's what I thought. Thanks for confirming." She managed a small smile, her cheeks warm. "Glad I could help." He lingered for a moment, as if he might say more, then offered another easy smile before walking away. Margaret stood frozen, the brief encounter leaving her oddly breathless. As she pushed her cart through the rest of her list, she kept catching glimpses of him. A flash of his jacket near the produce section, the way he bent slightly to examine a carton of eggs. She told herself it was silly, the way her heart fluttered. He was probably in his late 20s or early 30s, young enough to be her son. Yet, when she saw him again at the checkout, he gave her another smile, this one softer, more lingering. "Have a good day," he said as he packed his reusable bag. "You too," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Driving home, Margaret couldn't shake the memory of his smile. It wasn't just that he was handsome, though he was. It was the way he seemed so effortlessly kind, so present in a way that felt almost foreign to her. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Margaret had convinced herself it was nothing. A fleeting moment, a chance meeting in a grocery store. But as she unpacked her groceries, she found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like years. Something had shifted, though she didn't yet understand what it was. All she knew was that her quiet, predictable life suddenly felt a little less predictable. The days passed, but the encounter at the grocery store lingered in Margaret's mind. She told herself it was nothing, a passing moment, a stranger's kindness. Yet his face stayed with her, like a melody she couldn't quite forget. The following Tuesday, Margaret found herself back at the same store, her list clutched tightly in her hand. She told herself it was coincidence. After all, she always shopped on Tuesdays. But her heart betrayed her, beating faster as she pushed her cart through the aisles. Halfway through her shopping, she spotted him again. He was by the canned goods, holding a can of soup and looking at it as though it held the secrets of the universe. Margaret hesitated, unsure if she should approach. Would he even remember her? As if sensing her presence, he looked up and smiled. "Hey, cereal expert," he called out, his voice warm and familiar. She laughed despite herself. "I wouldn't go that far." He took a step closer, holding up the can. "Okay, what's your take on this? A decent meal? Or should I avoid it like the granola?" Margaret tilted her head, pretending to study the label. "Well, it's better than skipping dinner, but not by much. You could do better." He chuckled, putting the can back on the shelf. "Noted. I should probably take your advice more often." They talked for a few more minutes. Nothing extraordinary, just small pleasantries. She learned his name was Ryan, and he was new to the area, working remotely while finishing his master's degree in environmental science. He mentioned how he liked the town's quiet charm, a welcome change from the bustle of the city he'd left behind. I'm still figuring out the best spots, he admitted. Grocery stores included. Margaret smiled, her initial shyness fading. Well, this one's as good as any. The farmer's market on Saturdays is nice, too. His face lit up. I'll have to check it out. Thanks for the tip. They parted ways. But Margaret left the store feeling lighter, as though she'd been given a gift she hadn't expected. It wasn't just his friendliness. It was the ease with which they had spoken, as if they had known each other far longer than a few minutes. The next time they ran into each other, it felt even more natural. He asked her advice about pasta sauces, and she teased him about his apparent inability to shop without consulting someone. Soon, their exchanges became a routine. On one occasion, they ended up in the parking lot at the same time. Ryan was loading his groceries into his car when he paused, glancing at her. Hey, would you like to grab a coffee sometime? It'd be nice to talk without a cart between us. Margaret froze, her heart thudding in her chest. Was he asking her out? Surely not. But his expression was open and friendly, without a trace of awkwardness. That sounds nice, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. They exchanged numbers, and the next week they met at a cozy cafe downtown. The conversation flowed effortlessly, covering everything from books to travel to his passion for environmental work. Margaret found herself laughing more than she had in years. By the end of their coffee, she felt something unfamiliar, a sense of anticipation, of possibility. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something. As Ryan walked her to her car, he smiled. Thanks for meeting me. I'm glad I ran into you at the store. Margaret smiled back, her cheeks warm. Me too. Driving home, she allowed herself to admit the truth. She enjoyed his company, more than she'd expected. And though she couldn't quite explain why, she was looking forward to seeing him again. The weeks that followed were a blur of small moments, coffee dates, casual conversations in the grocery store aisles, texts exchanged late at night. Margaret found herself thinking about Ryan more often than she ever thought she would. At first, it was just his company she enjoyed. The way his laughter was like a breath of fresh air in the quiet corners of her life. He was easy to talk to, easy to be with, and his presence was like the sun creeping through the blinds on a cold morning. But something shifted as the days wore on. Margaret began noticing things she hadn't before. How his hand looked when it brushed against hers in a crowded aisle, how his voice deepened when he spoke of his hopes and dreams, how his eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary when they shared a quiet moment. It wasn't love, not exactly. But there was something more than friendship that she couldn't deny. And that realization left her breathless, as if she'd stepped into a room full of light and couldn't quite find her way back. One evening, they were sitting together at a cafe, a comfortable silence hanging between them as they sipped their drinks. Ryan was talking about a recent trip he'd taken to the coast, but Margaret wasn't really listening. Her attention was drawn to the way his lips moved when he spoke, the way the corner of his mouth lifted in a half-smile, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. It struck her all at once, the intensity of her feelings. She had been brushing them aside, telling herself they were just fleeting, that this was simply a pleasant friendship with someone younger. But now, as she looked at him, her chest tightened and her breath faltered. Ryan paused mid-sentence, noticing her sudden stillness. Margaret? You okay? She blinked, caught off guard by his concern. I'm fine, she said quickly, though the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. I was thinking. About what? His voice softened, a quiet curiosity in his eyes. Her mind raced, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain the turmoil inside her? The way her heart ached when he smiled. How his presence filled the empty spaces of her days. How could she put into words that she was falling for him, despite everything? Despite the age gap, despite the fact that she had never imagined herself in this kind of relationship. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Instead, she smiled faintly and shook her head. Nothing important. Ryan watched her for a moment, his eyes searching hers. Then, with a quiet nod, he leaned back in his chair. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here. Margaret's heart swelled at the simple offer. But she knew deep down that talking about it would only make it real, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. As they finished their drinks and parted ways, Margaret couldn't stop the swirl of emotions that flooded her. She had crossed a threshold. What had once been a comfortable, easy connection had transformed into something deeper, something that both frightened and excited her. Back home, she sat in the quiet of her living room, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. She had always prided herself on being in control, on keeping her emotions in check. But with Ryan, everything felt different. She couldn't deny the pull between them, the undeniable chemistry that neither of them had asked for, but that seemed to exist between them anyway. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something close, a spark that had caught fire inside her, and she wasn't sure how to put it out. Margaret had always considered herself practical, grounded. Emotions were something she managed, not something that managed her. But as her feelings for Ryan deepened, she found herself walking a tightrope between desire and doubt, excitement and fear. Her mind became a battleground. One moment, she allowed herself to revel in the way Ryan made her feel, alive, seen, desired in ways she hadn't felt in decades. The next, she was awash with guilt, her thoughts running rampant with questions she couldn't answer. What would people think if they knew? What does he even see in me? Am I foolish for feeling this way? Her internal debates became so consuming that even the most mundane activities felt tinged with uncertainty. Grocery shopping had once been a straightforward chore. Now every trip to the store carried the possibility of seeing Ryan. Her heart would leap at the thought, and yet she dreaded it too, fearing the intensity of her own emotions. One sleepless night, Margaret found herself staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The lines around her eyes were more pronounced than they had been a decade ago. Her silver-streaked hair fell in waves around her face, her once youthful skin now marked by time. She traced a finger over the faint crow's feet at the corners of her eyes, a reminder of years she couldn't reclaim. She thought of Ryan, his easy smile, the way he spoke about life with a vibrancy that both enchanted and terrified her. She couldn't understand why someone like him, a man so full of energy and possibility, would spend so much time with her. Was it pity? Curiosity? Or was it something more? She felt a lump rise in her throat as the reality of her feelings weighed heavily on her. It wasn't just attraction. She cared for him, deeply, achingly. And with that realization came a fear she hadn't anticipated. The fear of losing what they had. Would he pull away if he knew how she felt? Would he see her differently, less warmly, if he understood the depth of her emotions? Margaret began avoiding him, retreating into the safety of her solitude. She skipped her usual coffee runs, timed her grocery trips for odd hours, and replied to his texts with short, polite responses. But the distance didn't bring her the clarity she hoped for. Instead, it made her ache for him even more. One afternoon, as she sat by her kitchen window, nursing a cup of tea, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Ryan. "Hey, haven't seen you around lately. Everything okay?" She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She wanted to reply, to tell him the truth, that she was scared, confused, and utterly captivated by him. But her fingers hovered over the keyboard, paralyzed by fear. Instead, she typed a simple response, "I'm fine, just busy. Hope you're well." His reply came almost instantly. "Let me know if you need anything, okay? I miss our talks." Tears stung her eyes as she read his words. His kindness only made her feelings more difficult to bear. She wanted to see him, to feel the warmth of his presence, but she wasn't sure she could handle the emotions that came with it. As the days passed, Margaret knew she couldn't continue living in limbo. She had to confront her feelings, if not with Ryan, then at least within herself. She couldn't keep running, couldn't keep hiding from the truth of what her heart wanted. Sitting alone in her living room one evening, she made a decision. It was time to take a step forward, to see if the connection she felt with Ryan was as real as it seemed, or if it was simply a beautiful illusion she had conjured in her loneliness. Margaret spent the next few days in a whirlwind of emotions, teetering between courage and hesitation. She replayed Ryan's messages in her mind, his words laced with concern and warmth. Each time she read "I miss our talks," it was as if a hand reached through the screen, pulling her closer to him. Her usual self-reliance warred with an unfamiliar longing. She had always prided herself on being independent, a woman who didn't need anyone to complete her. And yet, there was Ryan, someone who had unknowingly begun to fill the quiet spaces in her life. It was a Thursday evening when she finally made up her mind. The thought of inviting him over felt bold, almost reckless, but there was a part of her that craved the chance to know him more intimately, to see him in the space where she felt most herself. Margaret stared at her phone, the blank text message screen taunting her. She typed out a few drafts, each one more awkward than the last, before settling on something simple. "Hi Ryan, I've been thinking. I'd love to catch up. Maybe you could come over for tea this weekend." She hit send before she could overthink it. The moment the message went through, her stomach twisted into knots. She set the phone down and walked away, needing distance from the decision she had just made. When the phone buzzed a few minutes later, her heart leapt. She picked it up, her breath catching as she read his response. "I'd love to. What time works for you?" Margaret exhaled slowly, her hands trembling. This was happening. She set a time and spent the next 2 days preparing, not just her home but herself. She cleaned the house with a meticulousness she hadn't felt in years, arranging the living room just so, setting out her best teacups, and debating which cookies to bake. But more than that, she found herself standing in front of her closet, trying on different outfits like a teenager before a first date. She finally settled on a simple but elegant dress, soft and comfortable but flattering. She studied herself in the mirror, smoothing the fabric over her hips. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself. But the fluttering in her chest reminded her that it wasn't. This mattered. By the time Saturday afternoon arrived, Margaret was a bundle of nerves. When the doorbell rang, she took a deep breath, steadying herself before opening the door. Ryan stood there, holding a bouquet of wildflowers, his usual easy smile lighting up his face. "Thought these might brighten your day," he said, handing her the flowers. Margaret felt a warmth spread through her chest as she took them. "Thank you, Ryan. They're beautiful. Come in." As he stepped into her home, the space suddenly felt different, warmer, more alive. Margaret led him to the living room, where the tea was already steeping on the coffee table. "I didn't know you liked flowers," she said, setting the bouquet in a vase. "I figured everyone does," Ryan replied, sitting down with an ease that made her feel both comforted and exposed. They began to talk, the conversation flowing as naturally as ever. But this time, Margaret felt an undercurrent of something deeper, a sense of possibility that had never been there before. As she poured tea and watched him laugh at one of her stories, she realized how much she had missed his presence these past weeks. He belonged here in her home, sharing these moments with her. For the first time in years, Margaret felt hopeful. Whatever came next, she knew this moment, this connection, was worth the risk. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the walls. Margaret had settled into the armchair across from Ryan, a plate of her freshly baked cookies between them. His laughter, rich and unrestrained, filled the room as she recounted a story from her younger years, a tale about a disastrous attempt at gardening that had left her neighbors in stitches. "You're telling me you actually planted daisies in your tomato patch?" Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. Margaret grinned, her cheeks warm. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Who knew they'd take over? Their shared laughter lingered, and when it faded, the quiet wasn't awkward. It felt safe. Margaret reached for her teacup, glancing at Ryan as he leaned back on the couch, looking entirely at home. He noticed her gaze and smiled. "You have a knack for making people feel comfortable, you know." She blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity in his tone. "I don't know about that." "I do." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on his knees. "You've been such a calming presence in my life, Margaret. I didn't realize how much I needed that until I met you." Her heart fluttered at his words, and she looked down, tracing the edge of her teacup with her finger. "I could say the same about you," she admitted softly. "You've brought a kind of light into my days that I didn't think I'd feel again." When she dared to meet his eyes, they were watching her with a depth that made her breath catch. The air between them seemed to hum with unspoken words, the room suddenly feeling smaller, more intimate. Ryan cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "I should probably help you clean up," he said, gesturing toward the table. Margaret shook her head, smiling. "You're a guest. Sit and relax." But he ignored her protest, gathering the empty cups and plates. Together, they moved into the kitchen, the proximity of their bodies in the tight space making her acutely aware of his presence. When he handed her a plate, their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt through her. She glanced up at him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. His expression was serious, almost searching, as though he were trying to decide something important. "Margaret," he said quietly, his voice low. "Yes. I don't want to overstep, but—" he hesitated, taking a step closer. "I feel like there's something here, something I don't want to ignore." Her breath caught, her pulse racing. She opened her mouth to speak but found herself at a loss for words. He reached out, his hand hovering near hers as if seeking permission. When she didn't pull away, he gently took her hand in his thumb brushing against her knuckles. "I've been drawn to you since the first day we met," he admitted. "And I don't care about what anyone else might think. I want to know if you feel the same." Margaret's heart felt like it might burst. The vulnerability in his voice, the honesty in his eyes. It was everything she hadn't dared to hope for. Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes as she whispered, "I do, Ryan. I've been trying to fight it, but I do." The weight of those words hung between them, transforming the moment into something sacred. Slowly, he leaned closer, his lips brushing against her cheek, a gesture that felt more intimate than any kiss she could remember. For the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to embrace what she wanted, letting go of the fear that had held her back. In Ryan's eyes, she saw not just desire, but respect, care, and the promise of something beautiful. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she wouldn't face them alone. The days that followed their intimate moment felt like a dream, soft and untouchable, yet undeniably real. Margaret spent hours reflecting on the tenderness they shared, her mind replaying the warmth of his hand in hers, the depth in his gaze. She had always believed that love was something reserved for the young, those who still had the world to conquer, the years ahead to share their lives. But Ryan had shown her otherwise. It wasn't just his youth that had drawn her in. It was the way he listened, the way he saw her, not as a woman of her age, but as someone vibrant, full of stories and potential. He didn't shy away from her wrinkles, her silences, or the weariness in her bones. He embraced all of her, just as she was. One afternoon, as she sat by the window watching the sun dip below the horizon, Margaret let herself consider the implications of what had begun to blossom between them. The societal judgment she had feared, the whispers about age gaps and fleeting connections, all seemed distant now. Ryan hadn't made her feel like a number. He had made her feel alive. She thought about the years of her life, years she had spent alone, years that felt like an endless stretch of routine. The idea of love had seemed so far away, a dream that belonged to another version of herself. But Ryan had brought it back, reminding her that love didn't have an expiration date. The phone buzzed on the table, pulling her from her thoughts. She picked it up, smiling when she saw his name flash on the screen. "Hey, just wanted to check in. How's your evening going?" She responded with a simple, quiet, "But thinking of you." Her heart skipped a beat when he replied almost immediately, "Same here. Can't wait to see you tomorrow." There was something in the way he communicated, something that transcended the usual pleasantries. She felt it in every word, every message, as though they shared a rhythm only the two of them understood. Margaret leaned back, her heart full, but also a little scared. What did it mean to love again at her age? Was she clinging to something fleeting, or was this real? She wasn't sure, but she realized she didn't have to know everything right now. What mattered was that she felt seen, cherished. She had been waiting for something, someone, to awaken her life again, and now that she had, she knew she couldn't push it away out of fear. Her thoughts drifted to the moments they shared, their walks in the park, their conversations that stretched into the night. How natural it all felt, like they had known each other for lifetimes. Ryan was not just the spark in her life. He was the kindling, the warmth that made the fire burn brighter with each passing day. And for the first time in years, Margaret allowed herself to believe in the possibility of something lasting, something deeper than mere fleeting romance. As she turned off the lights that evening and settled into bed, Margaret smiled to herself. She didn't need to have all the answers. She didn't need to rush. What mattered was that, in this moment, she was open to love in all its unexpected forms. Age was no barrier, love was timeless, and she had found it when she least expected it. As the weeks turned into months, Margaret and Ryan's connection deepened in ways neither of them could have anticipated. Their moments together became a blend of gentle rhythms and intense moments of clarity. There was a sweetness in the way they held hands, an unspoken understanding that neither age nor time could diminish. Margaret began to let go of the lingering doubts that had once clouded her thoughts. She found herself smiling more, waking up with a sense of excitement she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just about the romance, though that, too, was a part of it. It was the feeling of being truly seen, of being valued in a way that she had nearly forgotten was possible. She thought back to the woman she had been before Ryan came into her life, the one who had resigned herself to quiet evenings and unspoken regrets. Now she was someone different. She was a woman who had embraced the unexpected, who had chosen to open her heart again, despite the risks. Ryan's presence in her life taught her to redefine love, to see it not as something that belonged only to the young, but as something that could be cultivated at any age, in any circumstance. They had both faced their fears, their hesitations, and now they were navigating the complexities of their relationship together, unafraid, unashamed. The outside world, with its judgments and assumptions, had little hold over them. It was the quiet moments between them, the late-night conversations, the shared silences, the look in Ryan's eyes when he spoke her name, that mattered most. These were the things that made all the difference. These were the things that made love, in its most profound form, so powerful. As Margaret stood by the window one evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, she reflected on the path she had taken. She had faced fears of judgment, the whispers about age and expectation. But now, standing in this moment, she knew those fears had been unfounded. Love wasn't about fitting into anyone's expectations. It was about feeling it, living it, no matter where you were in life. She thought of the future, not with hesitation but with hope. There were still moments of uncertainty ahead, challenges to overcome, but she knew she would face them with Ryan by her side. Together, they were rewriting what it meant to love, to age, and to live fully. In the end, Margaret had learned that love was not confined by age, not limited by time, and certainly not determined by others' opinions. Love, she had discovered, was something that could be found at any stage of life, a treasure waiting to be uncovered when you were brave enough to seek it out. And so, with a heart full of newfound confidence, she smiled softly to herself. She had chosen to follow her heart, and in doing so, she had found something beautiful, something real, something that would carry her forward into the next chapter of her life, full of possibility and warmth. Love, it seemed, had only just begun.